How you doing, Margaret?
I'm good.
Hey, thanks for joining me today. I'm here with Margaret. Oh gosh, Margaret Bjarnado. How'd I do, Margaret? I'm
That
improving.
that was actually pretty good. You just have to go
I,
for it.
all right, I jump in. Well, Margaret is someone that I've become a quick fan of. We did a podcast, which I encourage you to listen to, and went into it, some of her history and her motivations and her thoughts in the future around pay equity and algorithmic bias. And we're actually going to talk about those themes today. And I actually want to highlight an article that she co-authored that was featured in HBR back in January. And we are going to cover some of these themes. So if you haven't given it a read or seen it, I encourage you to do that. With that staging, Margaret, if you would introduce yourself and how you got inspired to get into this work.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And first of all, thank you so much for having me. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about these things. So I'm Margre Bjarnadóttir, and I'm an associate professor of management science and statistics at University of Maryland, where I'm a part of the business school. So Robert H. Smith School of Business. And my research has always been kind of on the intersection of machine learning and optimization. So think about data-informed decision making. So that's where my research interests lie. And this adventure, I'm just going to call this my adventure into people analytics, really started as a research problem. So I had a COO that was complaining. They had an 8% pay gap. They had been trying to close it for over a year by being very mindful in all of their decision making. But when they measured the pay gap again, it was still 8%. So then it became very clear to them that you don't fix these problems with good intentions alone. You need good quantitative tools. So, and to me, that sounded like an awesome research problem, right? Because you have all the data on all the employees, and you need to determine, which actions should we take to close these pay gaps. So for me, it was like a mathematical modeling exercise that now has lasted 8 years or so. So that's how this got started. Yeah.
Well, let's jump right in it because pay equity in particular has been a goal. It's been talked about for a generation, if not longer. When Barack Obama took office, his first bill that he signed was a Lilly Ledbetter Act. It was effectively pay equity, and here we are. It's still pervasive that particularly gender pay equity hasn't moved to a large degree when we look at society and even in organizations. So why do you think that is? And as important as anything, what can be done to start remedying this very real problem?
Yeah, I mean, a large part of the problem, I think two things, right? So if we talk about why did nothing happen, I think one, the legislation didn't have any bite. So when you think about both the legislation over in Europe as well as here, the equal pay for equal work, it simply did not work because you can limit yourself to such a small group of people. Everybody's unique, right? We're all unique humans and we do unique work, right? So it didn't have much bite. So that was one part, like there wasn't a stick. And then I think another thing, and that is fast changing, which is driving change. And then there's a cultural shift. I think over the past 5 years or so, it's just no longer acceptable that somebody's being paid less because of the color of their skin or their gender or their orientation, etc. So that thinking has shifted, and what the legislations and regulations are helping, especially certain states in the US and over in Europe, is that they are forcing companies to take a look at their data. So oftentimes these legislations, they don't have a fine mechanism. So for example, in my home country, Iceland, the legislation is just you need to do an analysis, period. It doesn't say anything about that you have to have a 0% pay gap. It doesn't say anything about, you have to get below this threshold in a certain period of time, but it forces you to take a look at your data. And once you take a look at your data, the conversation really shifts because it's no longer hypothetical, right? We all have good intentions, right? So why would I think that my compensation decisions have been biased? Because I've been putting my best intentions towards them, right? But now if I look at my data and whoops, there's a 7% pay gap, well, it changes the conversation a little bit. So just that fact that companies are actually looking at their data it changes the conversation from this hypothetical, I think everything is fine, into, okay, now what do we do to eradicate the problem and move forward?
Well, let's talk about that, because when say going back, say 8 to 10 years ago, where this started to elevate not only in terms of priority, but the quality of the data that was being produced to highlight the problem. And here we are, say 8 to 10 years hence, and in many cases it hasn't moved. So there's a bunch of stuff between, the current state and the future state when we go back in time, and changes were attempted, yet a lot of this inequity has perpetuated. And of course, the decisions that are being made from, whether asking previous, compensation, before you're hired, obviously promotion opportunities, elevated, increases in salary, bonuses, and the like, there's a lot of decisions inherent in there which generate, data. So going back to the question, why hasn't it moved, and why, what from a process perspective, as well as an analytical perspective, needs to be done to make sure that we actually improve the needle? Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of to my previous point is that we have to look at the data. So as soon as we can put the mechanism in place that force people to look at their data, I think that's when we make the biggest leap forward. So going back to, I always call Iceland my sandbox.
I'm sure they appreciate it. The island of the sandbox.
It's a country of 350,000 people. So we're like a town in the US, but we're a proud nation of 350,000. So, I mean, just what I observed there, is there has been huge change. So what was thought to be really good 5 years ago, you're no longer a pay equity leader if you have a 3% pay gap or 2% pay gap. So, and a lot of the companies are, publicly disclosing their adjusted, meaning their equal pay gap. So apples to apples, after accounting for everything that drives pay decisions. So the zero is becoming the new norm in Iceland. And I think, what do we need to move the needle? I mean, there's a lot of kind of legislative efforts ongoing. Some of them are, you have to publish your unadjusted pay gap, right? So just the difference in averages between the genders. I mean, that's the first step, but then that is still, you can kind of explain things away, and, it doesn't start to address, okay, do you have a fair compensation system in place? But at least it starts to force companies to look at some of their data. So, yeah.
And they have to look at their data with an educated lens. I mean, a book that I'm almost through right now is Adam Grant's Think Again. And it's been even formative for me at this stage of my life and career. It talks about having a scientific mindset and creating a rethinking loop at an appropriate level of frequency. In other words, don't just hold on to your legacy thinking and premises and ways of being. We have to shift as new information come in, which invites the question, what is that new information? What is the data? Not only the quality of the algorithm, but what is the data itself? So this is a segue into data quality, data appropriateness, and algorithmic bias, which I know relates to pay equity from your perspective. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, sure. So when we think about, if I give you a tad bit of background, and then I'll address your question. So when we think about pay equity and kind of where we were and where we are moving towards, it really used to be an auditing exercise. Like once a year, maybe every 2 years, you would take a look at your data, somebody would estimate your pay gaps, you would do some fixes, and then you would just set it aside. I think how things are changing now is that it's becoming integrated to all your compensation processes. So one of the things, because you're talking about new thinking and how we think about pay equity, one of the kind of acknowledgement is that we all have our blind spots, right? We all have our biases and they affect our decision making. So we need to integrate pay equity into all the processes. And then how does that relate to data, which was actually your question. So one of the things when we think about, okay, what is an equitable pay, a starting pay, or somebody's getting promoted, how do we make an equitable decision? So we could our data, right, of the current organization. But we also know that a lot of the compensation 2, 3, 4 decade, right, have been biased. So then how do we bridge between the data that we have? And so there's a lot of thinking in, okay, moving forward, how do I want my pay structure to be? How do I make sure it's equitable within my current organization? And what is the best path forward? So I think the rethinking is happening a lot around not only just measure a static point in time, but viewing the pay equity data as an evolving process that needs to be monitored and looked at continuously.
And this invites the question for me, who does that? Who's qualified to do that? Because that is arguably a trained researcher, a trained data analyst. However, a technologist might have a role. Obviously, someone who is influencing, if not owning or stewarding the compensation process. And obviously, leaders ultimately are making decisions on how money is getting allocated. So, thoughts there. Who needs to be deciding, what data is collecting and what analysis are being done?
Yeah. You don't ask yes or no questions, do you?
It's not the first time I've been accused of that. So
this could be a topic for a half an hour. But I think, okay, so what needs to be done and who needs to make those decisions? So at the core of it, yes, there needs to be someone who has good insight, not only into data, but the organization, right? So if we just take a concrete example, what we typically and often see in organization is that someone was promoted to a manager, then they didn't work out as a manager, but they are an awesome specialist. So they get moved to a specialist role, but they keep their management salary, right? This is a story that happens over and over again. So then, when we think about, okay, how would that influence our compensation decisions? There needs to be someone kind of with a knowledge or insight to recognize that some of these data issues or some of the information is not reflective of our current processes. So then we need to think about, okay, so yes, to your point, we need to have the comp department or whether it's the HR department, depending on the setup, think about those things, flag those that should not be influencing paid decisions. So, people that are on compensation not reflective of their status. But then I think one of the key parts when we think about translating pay equity into all of these compensation processes, we need to make it easy for those making the decisions that might not have the training as data scientists or, statisticians or, whatever degree we want to call it. We have to make it easy and transparent for them, right? Mm-hmm. So then how do we take the results of the pay equity analysis, rebranded or reframe it so that those who are in the business of hiring people, so that they can do and make good decisions at the scale. So one of the organizations that I have worked with has 140,000 employees, right? Their turnover is about 10%. That makes 14,000 hires a year. So you can think about, okay, then how do we bring pay equity to scale, right? We have to make sure that it's easy enough for those who are making the decisions that they can make good, equitable decisions. And, and then it falls on people like me to build the right tools to enable that. And I think, well, I've told you, I don't know if I told the audience that, I've been in the business of translating analytics into easy to understand concepts for the past 15 years of my life as a professor. So I think that has really also influenced my thinking about how do we present, these results and how can we take these results that might have complicated models in the background, but how do we translate them so that they're easy to understand and transparent and can support ongoing decision making. And I think that's so important because there's not going to be a data scientist supporting every single hiring decision.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And actually, that's a perfect segue because I know you have some slides on algorithmic bias and did I say bias or bias?
I
Bias,
don't know.
as well as like the fairness of ML because of machine learning. Because everyone thinks about, I shouldn't say everyone, many just find this to be an esoteric kind of black box. And we have been doing math on pay equity and other human resource and people data for certainly the past 20 years, but going back literally 100 years when we look at researching organizational behavior and individual behavior within it. But certainly the speed and scale and scope of data has elevated over the past 10 years specifically. And the application of machine learning, we need to do this, we need to do AI, but there are risks in that. Do you mind sharing your thoughts and ideas and cautions about doing that?
Yeah, sure. So, what I decided to share with you today is based on a Wharton white paper. So we did that last year. We entered the competition. We managed to win it. So what I decided to do was and that really spoke to how do we need to think about algorithmic bias in the context of people analytics tools. So I have some slides, but then I hope you interrupt me so that this does not turn into some kind of professor's monologue. So
Is there a danger of that?
That's what I get paid to to do. So okay, so when we think about people analytics tools and machine learning bias, I think there has been a rapid change. So when I teach in my classroom, my MBA classroom, I often bring up this slide because I think, we were so excited about machine learning and the potential of machine learning that we weren't really thinking about, maybe there's some AI fairness that we need to think about. But there has been really an explosion in kind of the studies of algorithmic bias and fairness. I would say, each year now, hundreds of papers are published. So we have learned a lot about why does bias happen and how can we avoid it. So, and we can apply that to our, data modeling in the people analytics field. So, so how do we do that? So on the surface, the analytical process is straightforward, right? So we start by collecting our data, and then we build a model based on this data. The model then provides some predicted outcomes, so maybe the fair pay or the managerial potential, and then we incorporate that into our decision making. And so while on the surface the process may appear objective, it's filled with human judgment and bias that really can enter the process at any point. So when we think about people analytics tools and algorithmic bias, we need to take additional steps in order to understand, where might we falter. So one thing we need to do is to take the time to understand data biases, which I know is one of your favorite topics. So when we think about data bias in people analytics tools, they can stem from multiple sources, right? So one example is direct bias, right? So for example, we could include bias performance evaluation data in our compensation models, right? Or there can be an indirect bias stemming from the use of proxies. So the example I often take in the context of people analytics is that, maybe we use the grade point average as some kind of measure of intelligence or potential. But we all know that grades are, for example, influenced by how much an individual needs to work alongside school. So if we just blindly incorporate that into our models, we have just biased our models against those less affluent, right? So then from the data, so let's say we take good care of, the data is high quality data, we question all of our proxies and their validity. So then the next step is then to model, right? Create a model to support our decision making. So then our algorithms interact with our data to produce some kind of analytical tool, right? And I think this is where the academic literature has really taught us a lot in the last decade. So I think I might point out a couple of things. So first, the models will, and what is important to think about is that the models will typically work best for the majority group. So what do I mean by that? So if you have a population, maybe you're thinking about how can I best make my management tier more diverse. Well, it might be that you're faced with that your current population is majority male and white. And then it's important to note that if we just take a machine learning model, we apply it to that data, it will work for the best for the majority group. Because if you just take an off-the-shelf machine learning algorithm, it's basically trained to work to maximize the overall accuracy, and the majority group will just weigh the most in that. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So your models will always be tailored to your majority group unless you take specific modeling steps in order to ensure that other groups get let's call it an equal say in the algorithm.
Hey, Margre, may I interrupt you for a second? Because
Yeah.
I have a question about that and the process that you're leading. And I want to invite you to go to either slide 11 or 12 on your deck, because I'm going to jump a couple steps and you can back into it if you don't mind. It's this, is that the data that you collect, to your point, the selection thereof can be biased in and of itself. And then the model that we apply, there's a variety of analytical techniques that can be employed, and there's a variety of tools, and it takes arguably an expert at research and analytics to decide which analytical technique and or tools are appropriate. And oftentimes then, organizations don't have that in-house, and then they're sold something by a third party, and then they have a big blind spot. They don't understand the whole process, what I personally call the data to change process. What you have here is data to decisions. So my frankly pointed question is this, is that do you advocate that an organization, particularly mid-sized, a large organization, have someone who is a subject matter expert in research methods and analytical tools making these decisions and governing this process?
Yeah, so I don't know if I'm on the right slide. You have to tell me.
Back to
this one?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Sure. So when we think about this whole process, I think the answer is yes, if you're going to build your own internal tools, right? So I probably got a little bit lost and sidetracked in the kind of details around the model bias and checking. So yes, if you are planning to build your own internal machine learning tools, you need someone who is aware of how they can be biased, what are the state-of-the-art modeling techniques, how can you think about building the right tools. But then I would say, we have now good tools that can help us make sure we get things right. So if I get to back up, one of those is a bias dashboard. So let's say we are building a tool to promote our employees to the management level, thinking, and if we want, a machine learning model to identify employees that have potential, one way we can monitor then that tool is not only based on statistical performance, but actually some fairness metrics, right? Are we promoting equal proportion of employees from each demographic group that we're monitoring, for example? So here I just have some, I have broken it down by gender, but you can think about any kind of monitoring. So there are these simple tools that can do two things for you. They can monitor, okay, how good is the model for the different groups, but more importantly, what is the impact of the tool? So while statistical measures might be important, at the end of the day, what matters is who gets the opportunity. right? And then simply monitoring that in real time can bring that about. And then if I forward to another thing that we can do is that if we are adopting an external tool, we can have these checklists and make sure that we ask the hard questions, right? So if we are adopting an AI tool into our hiring or into where there is pay equity or any kind of internal decision making that affects our employees, we should be asking the vendors the hard questions, right? So how does the tool monitor algorithmic bias? How will it react to my data? How do we monitor it in real time? How will we, is there automatic monitoring for my company, right? So all of this, I think, will help us. So depending on if we are building internal tools with our data scientist on board, yes, we have tools that can help that and make sure that our tools are good. And then if we're adopting something external, it's about knowing what are the right questions to ask to make sure that we adopt something where these issues have been thought through and that enable us to monitor them in real time so that if there is an issue, we discover it in real time as opposed to a year down the road where all of these different decisions have been made.
Well, I mean, there's so much to talk about, and I love the way you think about it. Obviously, this is your profession; you're outstanding at it. And as we start to wrap here, I mean, we're gonna have to have you back, number one, because I have 100 questions, and we address some of these in the podcast.
Sure.
But to be fair, there are a lot of intricacies to this, and where I want to land is that many companies are trying to do the heavy lift of create a capability inside the organization. And sometimes that's appropriate. Other times it is appropriate to partner with a third party that has an expertise in a specific domain, as well as the research methods, as well as the tools, and that understands that, there are risks and opportunities in this process, and they're effectively taking that. So from an organizational perspective, they can outsource a lot of this work. So you have co-founded Pay Analytics as well. Can you speak a little bit about what you do and the value of working with a third party such as Pay Analytics?
Yeah. So, I mean, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about Pay Analytics. I think it ties into all of this, right? Because when we think about pay equity, it's really about thinking about how do we measure pay equity? How do we, address any pay equity issues in a fair manner, right? And then even just when we think about, okay, a fair manner, we all know that fairness is not a statistical property. So then we need to define what is fairness. And then just as we've been talking about, how do we make sure that moving forward, we make good decisions that are balanced and unbiased and fair? Because I think what we're increasingly seeing across pay equity studies, done here in the US and over in Europe, is that at the end of the day, if organizations can signal to their employees that the compensation decisions are fair, that is a really strong incentive, and it has been shown to increase retention of employees because they feel that they are being treated fairly. So to have that process in place, I think is important. So what we have done, because we're talking a lot about, these are complicated tools, these are complicated topics, how do we make sure that we do this in the right manner? So what we have really tried to do is to take all the math, right, and do that right, obviously, but then translate that into a tool that is super transparent, right? Because when you think about pay equity, it's almost, you think about transparency at the same time. So, the new European Pay Equity Act is actually called the Transparency Act. So what we need, I think also anytime, and more generally than just Pay Analytics, any people analytics tool, I think one of the core principles when we create these tools has to be transparency, because these decisions that we are supporting, I mean, they have impact on employees. So we have to be able to communicate, why are we making that suggestion? Why is that a good suggestion? And how does that get us closer to an equitable workplace? So I think that's really at the core of what we've been trying to do at Pay Analytics.
Well, Margaret, thank you for doing what you do. It's really important work, and you're outstanding at it. Like I said, been a fast fan of not only your articles and your thought leadership, but the way you think. It's just beautiful to hear. So yes, I would love to have you back, and best wishes with your venture with Pay Analytics and your teaching there at University of Maryland. So thank you. Appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to my return.
All right. Be well. All right. Take care.
Okay, bye.